Thanks everyone for joining this episode of our webinar series on best practices in eDiscovery. Today's session is on addressing the eDiscovery challenges of the mobile-first custodian. My name is Jeff Fugit. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Lexby, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Our webinars take place monthly and cover a variety of relevant eDiscovery topics. Space is limited to the capacity of our webinar platform. With the popularity of these sessions, I recommend registering promptly for the sessions that you're interested in. If you have technical issues or questions, please email webinars@lexby.com and we'll address them right away. Our webinars are available online at lexby.com for viewing via streaming video or downloadable as a PDF presentation or MP3 podcast. You'll find this webinar and a complete listing of other webinars at lexby.com. To be notified of future live and on-demand events, please email us at webinars@lexby.com or follow us on LinkedIn. A little bit about Lexby. We're based in Austin, Texas, and we provide a very affordable, cloud-based eDiscovery platform and services. We focus on equipping the boutique firm with an eDiscovery solution that gives them full control over the eDiscovery process, DIY capabilities, and incredibly fast performance. We deliver the industry's most affordable and full-featured DIY eDiscovery platform. We deliver the industry's fastest eDiscovery processing and document review software. So we get you from ingestion to review faster than anybody else. We just had a report come out that shows that we deliver the industry's fastest return on investment. And we have a host of experienced eDiscovery specialists and expert consultants who are ACED certified. If you'd like a demonstration of our platform, simply email us at sales@lexby.com and we'll get that scheduled for you. Joining us today is Robert Keeling. Robert is a partner at Sidley Austin, which has over 1,900 attorneys across the globe. He is an experienced litigator and authority on eDiscovery. He represents both plaintiffs and defendants in complex civil litigation throughout the nation and conducts internal investigations in the US and throughout the world. He has a JD from the University of Virginia and his undergrad from James Madison. Our agenda for today will cover the growth of mobile technologies, the corresponding eDiscovery challenges and considerations associated with that, and then best practices for eDiscovery for mobile devices. And perhaps 3Com is to blame for all of this, since they started this trend over 20 years ago with the first PDA, which is the Palm Pilot that you see there on the screen. With all joking aside, and before I turn it over to Robert, I'm going to share with you the scope and dynamics that make mobile devices a challenging but critical component of your eDiscovery strategy. As you can see, in the US alone, there are 396 million mobile device subscriber connections. So that means there are 1.2 connected devices for every person in the US. What's not represented here is the fact that most mobile operating systems now enable cross-device sharing and file access. So when you think about custodians and mobile devices, you need to think about it as an entire ecosystem comprised of the cloud, smartphones, tablets, laptops, and desktops. While the number of devices continue to grow, the amount of data traffic is through the roof. On this slide, the 13.7T represents 13.7 trillion megabytes. And there's a lot of evidence represented in that number. So I want to touch on the concept of mobile first. Mobile first is the concept of using a smartphone as the primary mode of communication. As you can see, the number of wireless-only households is showing strong growth, as well as the amount of time per day adults spend accessing apps and the internet on a smartphone or tablet. The next high growth element to the mobile first custodian is the proliferation of apps. This chart shows that in June of 2015, there were 100 billion iOS downloads. While social media is by far the most popular app category, there are shadow IT apps and chat apps that often contain important repositories of evidence. And so you need to really think beyond email. So why do custodian demographics matter? Well, the usage of mobile devices and the complexity of the mobile ecosystem goes up significantly with millennials. So it's important to understand the makeup, character, and quality of the custodians that you're dealing with and understand their propensity to use alternative modes of communication that may lead to additional evidence. As you can see on this chart, the age group from 18 to 34 purchases significantly more apps And studies have shown that this demographic actually prefers messaging and chat to email. So this massively growing and dynamic mobile ecosystem poses significant eDiscovery challenges. First off, how do you contain costs and comply with proportionality while capturing the evidence that you need? With Bring Your Own Device, enabling employees to bring their personal devices to work and connect them to their company's networks, it has big ramifications, especially for IP and employment cases. And this is often an area that needs scrutiny. The proliferation of chat apps, SMS, and social messaging platforms has largely displaced, more traditional forms of online messaging, and in particular email, with certain segments. Shadow IT or personal cloud and IT service accounts make it very easy to store and transfer data to the cloud. So it's never been easier to port data from one location to another. The ephemeral messaging also poses unique challenges. So self-destructing messages are now available across most popular messaging platforms, including Facebook Messenger, which now has secret messages, Google Allo, and Snapchat. And then advanced encryption creates device access issues, as we saw in the FBI versus Apple case a couple of years ago. So these are all challenges for eDiscovery with mobile devices. And before I turn it over to Robert Keeling to address these issues and more, I'm going to ask for your participation in a couple of polling questions to help set the stage. And our first polling question is, what percentage of your cases involve eDiscovery for mobile devices? All right, I'll go ahead and close out that question. And our next question is, how confident are you that your current eDiscovery capabilities are solving the challenges of mobile devices? Are you very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or have zero confidence? And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Robert Keeling. Robert?
Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Robert Keeling. I'm a partner with Sidley Austin, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you today about one of the more important issues that we are encountering in eDiscovery, which is discovery from mobile devices. And this topic covers a number of different issues, and you see that here on this slide that we're going to cover today. Kind of broadly speaking, talk a little bit about the rise of the smartphone, and then talking about the issue with the increasing proliferation of number of apps and types of apps and what that means for discovery. And then in light of that environment, how we're going to apply and how we are applying traditional discovery principles to mobile devices and the challenges that faces. So I don't have to remind anyone on the phone about kind of the rise of the smartphone over the past several years into all of our kind of collective lives, not just personal lives, but importantly, work lives as well. And really the kind of fundamental change that we have been seeing over the past several years is that the phone is becoming the primary device for many people. What we're seeing is that, and there's been surveys to this effect, but an increasing number of people use their phone as their primary device as opposed to their laptop or their, even desktop. And that applies even at work. What we're seeing is either phones or iPads are starting to replace the computer as the primary device for work for many people. For example, at Sidley, we now have the option to go without a laptop, instead use a Surface instead. And obviously we have significant work apps for our phones to interface and perform kind of the work for our clients. And that that is becoming more and more common across companies and across industries. And that presents kind of a unique challenge for us. Traditionally, on top of the normal communications with respect to emails and the like, there may be many cases, where data from the laptop has been part of the matter, like the user files, for example. And that is partly driven from the fact that the laptop was the primary device and interface for the relevant custodians as they conducted their work. And if that is changing into now mobile devices supplementing the laptop as that primary device for that custodian, it creates increasing challenges when you get to issues such as identification of data, preservation of data, collection of data for either litigation or a regulatory / subpoena response. And this phenomena is also kind of, as it says here, shifting kind of the traditional way of encountering and using data for a particular matter. Particularly, for example, in larger matters, maybe 5 years ago, you might have such a hear no evil or see no evil approach, where there are big parties on each side. The expense of mobile device discovery encouraged both parties not to really pursue such discovery. In other words, to focus much more on traditional sources of data, but not to try and pursue discovery from mobile devices, primarily because of cost and also goose gander issues, right? To have the corresponding parallel discovery requests coming back at them from discovery for mobile devices from their custodians. And so there was, particularly in traditional litigation, somewhat of a phenomena where mobile devices would not be part of a case unless kind of you had somewhat unique facts. And there's a question about whether that is changing in this kind of traditional discovery, given the changing use of mobile devices. And also, this is affecting the more kind of asymmetric discovery, as it's known. In other words, the consumer class actions, the product liability, those types of cases, securities class actions, where traditionally the plaintiffs might not have significant data themselves, which allowed the requesting party, their attorneys, to pursue significant discovery demands on typically would be the corporation, without kind of the fear that corresponding discovery requests will be coming back at their clients. The issue now is that their clients are using their mobile devices. They have data in text, they have data in social media and the like. And so what we're seeing is that there's now at least some skin in the game there. So even in kind of the traditional asymmetric type cases, you may have issues where that kind of, because both parties may have this data and may be faced with the challenges of this data, that the parties are kind of encouraged to play nice in the sandbox, so to speak. And so these are kind of types of issues that we are seeing with the changing of the mobile device and the power of the mobile device, with custodians using them increasingly for work and for kind of relevant activities. And that presents some unique issues because, as folks know, the smartphone contains different types of data than you might otherwise see in with a traditional laptop or desktop. Some is the same, For example, you might be able to get from the device itself, not through the apps, calendar information, contact information. You typically can get photos and videos and the like. And otherwise, there can be different information, right? So the text and chat messages typically are not contained on kind of the hard drive of a laptop. The web browsing information typically is the same, although what we see is that web browsing information on phones typically there's more data there, primarily because you don't have kind of the same remediation of web browsing history at the enterprise level that you might see on kind of enterprise Internet Explorer or Chrome applications on the user's laptop. Typically do not see that those types of policies being applied to a user's phone. And so while you might have kind of a limited browsing history on a laptop, the same may not be true on a phone, and you may have a lot more information. Now, granted, it's kind of the rare case where browsing history will be relevant, but it certainly is true that you have more of it on the phone. So when dealing with devices, you have this kind of dual phenomenon where you have some information kind of on the phone itself, some of which is detailed here. And then you have other information that may be identified in the apps that are contained on the phone. We'll get to that in a second. But before we get to that, I wanted to focus on one other point here, which is kind of the bullet second from the bottom, which is the geolocation and Wi-Fi history, which is something that is rather unique to the phone and the mobile device that you wouldn't otherwise see. And it is particularly important in certain cases. So again, in a contract dispute, where you're interpreting the language on the contract, geolocation history is going to be largely irrelevant, and probably largely irrelevant in my experience for the vast majority of cases. But in certain instances, like a trade secret matter, some employment disputes and the like, geolocation can be determinative. And there's a lot of different ways that this type of information can be gathered. So I think more people are aware of apps like Foursquare and the like, where geolocation data is almost the point of the app. And folks can understand that geolocation data can be gained from those types of applications. Wanted to note here that that's not all of the potential places where that type of data exists. So one of them is wireless networks. So if a custodian has kind of the wireless searching enabled for their phone is kind of constantly reaching out and identifying wireless networks as you just kind of walk around town, for lack of a better expression. Some of these are going to be known networks, and that the phone may connect to if it has that permission. But otherwise, there might be other networks that it's kind of registering with, but not connecting to. But those registering, those networks can still be, depending upon the settings, recorded in the phone, and there will be some identifying information with that wireless network. And so there are ways to, multiple ways to get geolocation data that you might not otherwise think. Another application that comes to mind, for example, is just travel apps, for example. When you check in and check out of, for example, your United or American or other flight applications, they'll typically have geolocation markers about your particular airport and the like that are being recorded. And the list goes on. There's kind of more and more, including photos and the like, that have that type of data to the extent it is going to be relevant for a particular case. And so when you think about data, so this is a kind of a screen capture from Celebrate, which is one of the mobile collection tools. There can be a significant amount of information that can be gained, right? And so typically on most matters, if you're collecting, you might collect from kind of the top two matters here, top two points here, which is messaging, what's on the Notes app. But there is a significant amount of other data that typically will be collected as part of the collection process if you're collecting broadly. And so just kind of understanding that this is all data that may be useful for a case. It may not, typically is not, but it really depends on the particular case at issue, whether this is actually appropriate for discovery. The point is, though, that this data exists, and it can be a lot. If you just look at kind of the web history or the SMS messages, you have thousands of documents or pieces of data for a single custodian, and this is kind of on top of the email and other user files that you might otherwise be able to obtain from that person's either email or other desktop collections and the like. So, as I was saying, what we see and that's kind of from the phone itself, but that's not all the data that is obtainable. And so there's a significant amount of additional data that can be obtained through the app itself. And this can take a lot of different ways. So what I have here is the Strava it's kind of global heat map. And this application got in the news recently because this application tracks your running, basically. Or I suppose it could be used for hiking as well and the like. But it tracks as you go on a particular run. And then when you aggregate it together, when the site itself, the app, aggregates it together, you have other information that is obtained, right? And so you have here, this is kind of aggregation of that data in the United States, and you see the significant amount of activity that kind of corresponds with population centers. This particular application got in the news because soldiers were using it as they went out for runs around their bases, and it enabled essentially the mapping of bases, including the perimeter, as well as the additional roads or paths within a base, just very inadvertently. I think it was, if I recall, it was identified by a relatively young kid, either New Zealand or in Australia, kind of noticed this. And, it's a particular effect of data from apps that is possible, even if it wasn't particularly intended. And of course, this app as well has the ability for, again, kind of that geolocation, kind of mapping data that we were talking about otherwise. So there's just a lot of different ways to get that type of data and cut it a lot of different, into a lot of different pieces, depending upon how it is particularly used. So you have first the app from the, you have first the data from the phone that could be obtained, and then much more as far as available data, you have the data that's contained through the apps. Now, the point to understand here is that this data is not sitting on the phone's hard drive. It's sitting instead in some server owned by the app developer, or in the cloud, so to speak, that the app developer is using. And so you have this significant amount of data, but you have to obtain the data. In order to obtain the data, you have to kind of go through the app, which puts a particular unique challenges that we don't traditionally have not otherwise seen in eDiscovery. So, for example, if you were collecting from email, you could do a capture of that mailbox. If you were collecting from the laptop, you could do a capture of all the user files in that laptop, and then you would have all the data, right? That's different with the mobile device. If you do a capture of a mobile device, you will get the information on the phone's hard drive, things like texts and notes and the like, but you likely will not get all of the data for the list of apps that are on that phone. You might get a small piece of it depending upon the app, but likely you will not get all of it. And so that creates some challenges because you might have different data is contained in different apps for a single custodian. And so it really raises questions about really what is actually important, because there's different steps that you have to go through to collect data from the different apps. So there's just typically no kind of uniform way to capture data from all of the apps. Each app is different in certain respects, and so what a collection technique that works on one app may not work on another. And of course, there's different data. So the types of data that you might find in someone's Instagram account is very different from the types of data that you could find in a WhatsApp account, right? And so creates a significant challenge from an eDiscovery point of view, from both identification and collection, to the extent you have to go to a mobile device. It creates a significant challenge as far as obtaining that relevant data from the different apps, and the types of data here. Again, it really can be significant. So you have, and it really also you layer on this, that a lot of these apps that we list here are typically used kind of for personal reasons, not for business reasons. So you might have kind of an enterprise Google Docs type account, and then the person might separately have their own Google Docs application on their phone. So you have to kind of make, in conjunction with a custodial interview, typically make decisions about what types of data would be needing to be identified or collected. And you also have particular challenges here with apps such as Snapchat and other types of applications where the design of the application is the data is transient, right? So that the communication is conveyed to the other person on the other side of that application typically, and then that data is not retained by the application itself, and it kind of disappears, for lack of a better word. And so it creates a challenge about how to categorize that application, right? So typically, with these types of both data on smartphones and data in apps, there is a initial kind of trying to put this data into pre-existing known boxes, right? And so there is kind of a knee-jerk reaction to think of data on the device itself as similar to data on the desktop of a laptop or computer. And it is similarly, people, in my experience, want to default to kind of communication apps and categorize them similar to emails, right? The problem is that is not always the case, right? Like people may be communicating via Instagram in ways that are entirely different from email. A Slack conversation is a very different thing than an email conversation often. And these communications using applications like Snapchat and the like are also very different. So kind of there is, to me, an open question about whether the applications that do not retain the data, instead, the data is read and then is no longer retained, how to treat that. And there's another argument that those devices, those apps, should be treated more like telephone calls. It's essentially the virtual equivalent of a telephone call. And you obviously wouldn't have a need to identify and collect a telephone call, right? And so there's a question about whether applications like that should be treated more like a telephone call rather than an email. And so I think that, again, is something that we obviously don't have any guidance from courts on that issue yet, but I think it will be kind of an issue that will be continuing to be more and more prevalent with respect to eDiscovery, because there's no practical way to retain that information. Even if you had a litigation hold, the kind of the point of that application is that there is no way to retain that data, much like a telephone call, right? And so it creates a lot of challenges for a company who may be even using the enterprise version of that to really truly retain that data when the retention of that data is essentially contrary to its design. So that is something that, again, will become more and more of an issue. But also we have kind of collection issues, right? So even if the data is retained, if there is a group Slack conversation, there's really a question about who the custodian is for that conversation, right? And it is harder to kind of take out pieces of a Slack conversation as far as responsive, identifying documents or data that's responsive to a discovery request or a subpoena. It's harder to pull out pieces of a Slack conversation as compared to pull out a particular email, right? And it's also somewhat more difficult to make cleaner custodial decisions if someone in a Slack conversation kind of enters the conversation and leaves the conversation, for example, and then may come back later. It's a difficult way to kind of slice and dice kind of traditional views of who is custodial to that data. And it's also just harder to review right now. And so kind of placing traditional views of eDiscovery and practices of eDiscovery is difficult with many of these applications. And in some times it's trying to put kind of a square peg in a round hole, and it doesn't quite work. And so that's, again, going to create and that issue is not going away. And so it's going to be a continuing issue with us and practitioners and corporations who have to deal with this as far as the challenges of kind of applications. So that, and on top of that, what you have is you have the, as it says here on the second bullet, you layer on top that privacy concerns, right? So you have a lot of these applications on somebody's phone are purely for personal use. I think for most people, the vast majority of the data on a phone, particularly if you go by gigabytes, is going to be personal, right? Because most of the data is going to be taken up by phones and videos. And so you're going to have 90% of the data on a phone is pictures of a person's kids and videos of like the school play. And so how do you kind of divorce that from data that might actually be relevant to a particular matter? And so that again is a continuing issue. And if you have kind of the enterprises going to things like Office 365 or kind of the enterprise version of Google Docs, if people are kind of continuing to kind of at the same time use for personal uses as well, that creates kind of the same issues, right? And so we really have this challenge. And kind of on top of that, right, as I said, most cases don't need this data. And so you might have a single note that might be relevant to a particular matter on the phone, and yet the phone has 50 gigabytes of data on it. And so trying to balance that and engage in, either, a particular logical collection, but really trying to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff on a phone and being respectful with privacy or having to comply with privacy regulations, depending upon the matter and the jurisdiction, creates another kind of challenge on top of kind of the traditional challenges engaged with collecting from mobile devices. So it's really this other type of layered complication on top of everything else. So, and then you have kind of the additional point here, kind of talked a little bit about messaging and chat apps, but kind of the social apps, increasingly people interact through their phone. So you might not, I think most people now interact with sites like Facebook and Instagram through an app on their phone rather than the going to the web and typing in facebook.com. And so you're going to have that kind of information in that in the phone itself, and that's how folks will be interacting with that application rather than through otherwise with the laptop or the like. And it's really like how you might also kind of be posting to this can be, its own challenge, whether they're posting through the app or directly through the sites that this occurs, and how that information is being uploaded, and then how that information is being downloaded. And then finally, the point that has been an issue for years that I've been experiencing is that this phenomenon of apps is increasingly proliferating to companies, where companies will have particular enterprise apps that can be downloaded and is downloaded to individuals, either company phones or user or personal phones. And these apps are they're designed for particular business purposes, right? One of those purposes typically is not to make it easy to extract that information in order to comply with discovery requests. And so you kind of run into the issue where you have to almost backward engineer the application in order to actually extract the data in a usable form. And it's typically quite complicated, and requesting parties and judges typically struggle to understand that. They think, well, you have this work app and you just press the virtual easy button and the data appears from the app in a usable form that can be used by the parties in discovery and at trial. And that is almost never the case. And it creates challenges, again, on how you actually deal with that information and convey the challenges of that to kind of the requesting party and to the courts. And that certainly seems, at least in my experience, a problem that is not going away, that more and more companies recognize that their employees are interacting with their mobile devices as a primary device. And so there's been a response from either the IT departments of those companies or from outside providers to make a series of enterprise apps that relate to different functions, right? And so again, that creates an entirely different issue that is being kind of overlaid onto this challenge. So you kind of talk about all these challenges, and then you have to face, well, when discovery requests, in light of the changes to federal rules, you have, well, what is reasonable and what is proportional, right? And so obviously that will depend upon the case, but that is certainly going to be a struggle here that will continue to be at issue. One is because of the challenge with collecting from mobile devices, whether you have this particular data elsewhere. So you might have, in my most recent example, a company app on a custodial's phone that is very hard to collect from, but the company may have a copy of that in their server that their IT department can more easily, copy and run reports out of. And so you might be able to get the data that way rather than trying to kind of engage in a cumbersome process to obtain the data through the particular device. And then same thing here, you might have the apps, what appears to the user is actually drawing from different sources. And so when I say here kind of reviewing and producing documents, kind of what does that mean? And what might be shown to the user is actually not kind of actually capturable. And that creates some issues if it's being drawn from different sources and being kind of combined for the user, that creates other issues as far as how you recreate that in response to a discovery request. And the other point here is just look that, like with laptop collections, you rarely will need kind of the full forensic collection from a phone. And so kind of, at least I have seen in some matters, kind of what I saw in my experience 12 years ago or so, where there was a default to collecting the full forensic image of a computer when all you needed was a few user files. The same is true with phones. You typically do not need everything with the mobile device. You typically are only looking for, if you're going to a mobile device, a very limited slice of data, on that device. So that again creates its own challenge, and it creates, a further challenge as far as again preservation obligations. Not only with kind of these ephemeral type apps where the data is not retained, but also with respect to even texts, right? Because different people, you are allowed, for example, on your iPhone, allows you to put different retention periods on your text. And so you might have a situation where you have 10 different custodians, and those custodians have different retention periods just on their device that they happen to set. And so it creates some challenges as far as what that means practically as far as identification and preservation. And as it says here, that oftentimes the data is not under the user's control, and so you're subject to how that application retains data rather than the user. So it's not kind of the traditional aspect where the user has 100 Office files on their laptop and they just need to be instructed not to delete those. If they're interacting with data through a third-party app, the custodian might not have any control over how that data is kept, how long it is kept, and the like. And so it creates some particular challenges with preservation. And again, it's in many ways a challenge of imposing traditional preservation concepts onto kind of a reality that is very different than how those preservation concepts evolved in kind of the land of going from kind of paper documents to emails in the early 2000s. And so that will continue to be a challenge practically about how to do that, and really whether different preservation standards should apply to this data. Namely, no preservation standards potentially should apply to some ways that that particular custodians may be using this data, given that it is so ephemeral. And you might have a range of options rather than more static standards with respect to identification, preservation, and collection of data. So that's kind of the broad overview. Obviously, it is a particular challenging area, and I think we'll continue to get even more so as we go. But particular issues that will come up, kind of the point is that this will continue to be a challenge for producing parties, and the kind of the ways to meet those challenges. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. That the way that you can try and address these challenges often differ depending upon the matter, depending upon what's at issue, depending upon the particular data or the particular app. And so it will be creating significant kind of challenges for practitioners as well as the individual custodians kind of going forward. And that is the challenge that we will be facing in the years to come. So to the extent, obviously, folks have further questions, I think we have, here other information here as far as contact information. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And there's other contact information for Jeff as well for other follow-up. So thanks to everyone, and I appreciate you listening in on this today.
Thanks, Robert. That was a really fascinating presentation on the mobile device landscape and how it impacts eDiscovery, as well as sharing some best practices on how to deal with that. I'm going to talk just briefly about LexB and how we help solve for some of these issues. LexB is a force multiplier when it comes to helping you solve for the challenges of mobile device discovery. First, when loading files collected from mobile devices, you typically see an increase in the sheer number of documents because you're dealing with social media, email, chat, native productivity apps like Keynote numbers and pages on the iPhone, as well as potentially enterprise apps. Because LexB processes to a normalized PDF, the hosting requirements are a fraction of the size of TIFFs and therefore much more affordable. So we say that we eliminate the TIFF tax. We also have no user fees and no case fees. Secondly, the platform's lightning fast, so it auto scales based upon the size of the ingestion and therefore can apply the appropriate amount of computing and memory resources to get you from review or get you from ingestion to review faster than any other platform. And then we also have lightning fast review sets and high-speed coding and tagging, and all of that helps you get your productions done faster. And then we've got very simple to use advanced technologies like advanced near dupe, as well as technology assisted review. And those can help you identify evidence quickly, get your documents coded quickly, and progress through the EDRM. And as I mentioned before, the explosive growth of apps on mobile platforms creates significant eDiscovery challenges. Lexby processes a very large set of files associated with mobile devices. Apple Notes and iMessages are typically extracted in a SQLite database, social media exports, collaboration platforms like Slack and Microsoft Teams. You have Office 365, Google Apps, and numerous other native applications that generate files on these devices. And it isn't just that we process the files, it's really how we process the files that makes your job a lot easier. We process files into the Lexby Uber index. So upon ingestion, we extract all the native characters from the documents, which captures speaker notes and presentation files, characters and hidden fields from spreadsheets, document edits, changes and contributors in collaboration platforms, and much more. And at the same time, all of those documents are OCR'd to capture characters from images, attachments, faxes, and more. And lastly, if you need your documents translated, then our translation engine, which supports over 100 languages, will feed any translated characters into the index. Therefore, you've got the largest data set to conduct your searches from, so you can find all the evidence and you can find all the privileged documents. And that leads me to our next polling question. And that polling question is, would you like a demonstration of the Lexby eDiscovery platform? So that's what I wanted to touch on in terms of Lexby assisting you with mobile device eDiscovery. I really appreciate you attending today. We'll be making the following available to webinar attendees. You'll have access to a recorded streaming version, an MP3 podcast, as well as a PDF. Please let us know if you have any questions or comments about this webinar, or suggestions for future topics. This webinar is part of our eDiscovery webinar series, and for notices of future live and on-demand webinars as part of the series, please email us at webinars@lexby.com or follow us on LinkedIn. And if you'd like to learn more about Lexby, please give us a shout. You can reach us at the toll-free number on the screen, or you can email us at sales@lexby.com. We'd be happy to put together a custom demonstration of the platform for you. And lastly, but certainly not least, I want to thank Robert for speaking on today's session. Robert, you did an excellent job, and we look forward to your participation on future webinars. Thanks, everybody.